Well, guys, welcome to the 20th lockdown learning session with Mr. Booth. Can you believe we're on number 20? I don't think any of us envisaged back in March that I would have to do 20 of these before I was seeing you all face to face again, but it's been a crazy old couple of months, hasn't it? Today, because it's number 20 and it's quite a milestone, and because of the thing that's got us here, which is COVID-19 and this pandemic, I've tried to pick something that is suitable for and kind of commemorative of the fact that we are all in this very peculiar situation together. So I've picked something that is actually, believe it or not, the earliest thing I've looked at by far over these sessions, and it's from the 1340s, which, if you do your maths, is way back. 1340s Italy, okay, and it's called the Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio. And if it weren't for this particular book, we wouldn't have had things like Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales in the 1390s, for example. You could even argue we wouldn't have Shakespeare in the form that he's in today as a result of this. This was a very influential piece of literature in the kind of early medieval period. And the reason I've chosen this today is because at the very beginning of the novel, if you, for want of a better word, you've got this description, a very vivid and very kind of realistic account of a pandemic of biblical proportions in Florence. So in the 1340s, Florence was struck by the Black Death, and in fact this was such a virulent and deadly plague that it killed 3 out of 5 people in Florence in the 1300s, and other cities around Tuscany, so Siena, Rome, Bologna, these kind of cities were all similarly hit, including as well other countries. This was a European-wide pandemic that killed over 50% of the population. It was truly horrendous. To put that in some perspective for you all, COVID has been disastrous for the economy and disastrous for families, torn families apart, but it's essentially been around about a 0.1% fatality rate. Okay, that means roughly, in the whole population, 1 in 1,000 people roughly have died from this. Okay, so if that, so we can't even compare the two. The one that I'm going to be showing you today is much worse, and the reason I've chosen this is because it reminds us about why we're all here. It gives us a kind of precedent in literature, a kind of something to base our thoughts upon, so we can go, we're not the first people in the world to experience this kind of lockdown. Florence was the same in the 1340s, but on a much more, like I say, much more serious scale. So very often in literature we're looking for precedents, things that kind of help us explain our own lives, help us explain what's going on in the world around us, help us sometimes explain what's going on in our own heads. I mean, literature, sometimes you meet a character in a novel or a play and you think, or you might read a poem and you think, wow, that's how I feel about that particular situation, and that's something I can relate to and it resonates with me, and that's why I've always enjoyed literature so much, because there's that ability to find a precedent, find a kind of common connection between you and the thing you're reading. And it is very often, literature at its best is the human experience, isn't it? We all hopefully know that. So yeah, here we are, number 20. I was trying to think, how long's lockdown been? It's been a hell of a long time, but it's hard to put it into kind of context, isn't it? We think, well, how long was it since I was last in my classroom with a class of 30? And it feels kind of a long time ago, but then something struck me today. I watched Tiger King on Netflix.
Carol Baskin.
I didn't even know what Tiger King was when we started lockdown, and I watched that series in lockdown. That was back in March. That's how long lockdown has been, and that really kind of made me realise. And even today, I'm realising that I'm wearing a very nice, hopefully you think so, very snazzy Ralph Lauren shirt that is possibly a homage to the same shirt that Joey Exotic got married in. So if you've seen the series, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That's a long time ago, guys. That's really made me stop and think. Wow, this has been quite a significant sort of event in all of our lives, and we're never going to forget it, are we? We're all going to know what people are talking about in 50 years when they say, "Oh, I remember the summer of COVID-19," and hopefully we are towards the tail end of this now, aren't we? Hopefully we are starting to see the light. Right, let me talk about today's session, guys. Number 20, let's go. We're going to read from chapter 1 of the Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio, okay? And I'm going to be showing you how he portrays the Florentine breakout of the Black Death in the 1340s. As we read this, because of course this is a translation, so in Italian book originally, it's been translated many times over the years, but this particular translation is from 1886. So for me, this particular translation says as much about Victorian ways of writing and the Victorian mindset maybe as it does about the original. So we're going to use today's session to help us improve our literacy and comprehension when it comes to particularly Victorian ways of writing, Victorian expressions, that kind of thing. So as we go, we're going to occasionally stop and say, well, this is what the writer is trying to say at this point. So the story goes, it's called the Decameron, which of course you've got the DEC, dec, which is very often Latin for 10. So Decameron, decade, decathlon, 10 events in the Olympics. December, funnily enough, used to be the 10th month of the Roman calendar. Okay, so you've got this idea of the dec meaning 10. So it's the Decameron. Why is that important? Because the story is that there are 10 characters who tell each other 10 stories each over 10 days. So this is the kind of premise, if you like, of the entire narrative, that 10 characters have all self-isolated. They've left Florence, the city, and they've gone to a villa, a kind of villa, I think it's called Villa Palmieri, which is about 2 or 3 miles away from the city. And all 10 of them have quarantined themselves in this place, and they're going to stay there for 10 days. And to pass the time, because they don't have Netflix and the internet, they're going to read one another's stories, and they're going to tell each other one another's stories, 10 each over 10 days. So 100 stories in total. So in a way, this is like the 14th century equivalent of the Arabian Nights. You know, it's got lots of little stories within it. But the premise of the entire piece is 10 characters in quarantine together. Incidentally, the word quarantine, again, you know, you can look at root words. Quarantine itself, which we are all in, comes from the original idea of 40 days. Quarantina or quaranta in modern day Italian means 40, and the old idea was that the Venetian the merchants who would arrive in Venice would, to make sure that they weren't bringing diseases from abroad, would go into a kind of quarantine for 40 days before they were allowed to embark their goods into the Venice harbour and get off their boat. So they had to kind of sit on their boats for 40 days to prove that they weren't carrying any deadly diseases. So you know, we very often get words from the Latin, don't we? You know, Decameron is no different to decade. Quaranta, quarantina, quarantine is no different to, you know, the Italian and the Latin either. We're going to start on chapter 1, and I'm going to read you a couple of paragraphs and help sort of decipher what's being said about this particular outbreak of plague today. Your homework for today's session, I'm going to leave in the description below the video an extra paragraph or two from chapter 1. So where we leave off, I will leave the rest in the description for you to leave me a summary. So your job is to write me a summary of what's going on. Without further ado, let's get started. We're going to look at paragraph 2 onwards of chapter 1. I say then that the years of the beatific incarnation of the Son of God had reached the tale of 1348, when, in the illustrious city of Florence, the fairest of all the cities of Italy, there made its appearance that deadly pestilence, which, whether disseminated by the influence of the celestial bodies, or sent upon us mortals by God, in his just wrath, by way of retribution for our iniquities, had its origin some years before in the East, whence, after destroying an innumerable multitude of living beings, it had propagated itself without respite from place to place, and so, calamitously, had spread into the West. So in this first paragraph of today's read, you've got the idea that the time frame is set. This is 1348, which he very decoratively describes as the beatific incarnation of the year of our Lord, 1348. So in other words, the year that Jesus was born. Since then, it's 1348 years. And in that particular year, you've got the outbreak of this plague, whether it was the result of celestial bodies, i.e. stars, or was it the result of God, the wrath of God? He does not know. But what he does know is it was very deadly. So he's suggesting, was it the result of kind of like the horoscope idea of like the star-crossed lovers maybe from Romeo and Juliet? Is this the result of misaligned stars in the sky, which of course many people did and still do believe causes bad luck? Or is it the result of God enacting vengeance upon us all? Next bit. In Florence, despite all that human wisdom and forethought could devise to avert it, as the cleansing of the city from many impurities by officials appointed for the purpose, and the refusal of entrance to all sick folk, and the adoption of many precautions for the preservation of health, despite also humble supplications addressed to God, and often repeated both in public procession and otherwise by the devout, towards the beginning of the spring of the said year, the doleful effects of the pestilence began to be horribly apparent by symptoms that showed as if miraculous. So in this next paragraph, you've got the idea that despite people's efforts, even including praying to God, so supplication would be on your hands and knees praying to God, which is, desperate. Obviously, the people are desperately praying for this to be stopped. Despite all that, symptoms would show as if miraculous upon people, just spring from nowhere. Not such were they as in the East, where an issue of blood from the nose was a manifest sign of inevitable death, but in men and women alike it first betrayed itself by the emergence of certain tumours in the groin or the armpits, some of which grew as large as a common apple, others as an egg, some more, some less, which the common folk called Gachicolli. So this was the local Florentine word for this, Gachicolli, which is a word for these very big lumps that were appearing in people's groins and armpits. So around the kind of lymph nodes and things, this was clearly at the body's reaction to catching this disease. From the two said parts of the body, this deadly Gachicolli soon began to propagate and spread itself in all directions indifferently, after which the form of the malady began to change, black spots or livid making their appearance in many cases on the arm or the thigh or elsewhere, now few and large, now minute and numerous. And as this Gachicolli had been and still was the infallible token of approaching death, such also were these spots on whomsoever they shewed themselves. So on anybody who showed visible signs of these particular lumps, they were almost an infallible token of approaching death, which is a kind of, again, a Victorian way of expressing that you were a goner, you were a certain goner at this point. There was no kind of saving you. It was a token in the way that, a token to Pleasure Beach might be a piece of metal that allows you on a roller coaster. It's just a symbol of your worth and what you're allowed to then go and do. These are these signs, these lumps are symbols that you are going to die. So it's a token, not in a positive way, but in a kind of like a foreshadowing sort of way, a negative way. Okay. Approaching death. Such also were these spots on whomsoever they showed themselves, which maladies seemed to set entirely at naught both the art of the physician and the virtue of the physic. Indeed, whether it was that the disorder was of a nature to devise such treatment, or that the physicians were at fault, besides the qualified, there was now a multitude both of men and women who practised without having received the slightest tincture of medical science, and, being in ignorance of its source, failed to apply the proper remedies. In either case, not merely were those that recovered few, but almost all, within 3 days from the appearance of the said symptoms, sooner or later died, and in most cases without any fever or other attendant malady. So the idea that people, despite their best efforts, even doctors, it was just an absolute kind of waste of time. It was futile. You were going to die. And also to exacerbate matters, to make matters worse, you've got kind of unqualified people trying to add their twopenneth, add their opinion, and say, well, I think you should probably, rub daffodils on your skin to make it better. Kind of coming up with nonsense that really did not help, because it's kind of adding all these kind of this kind of cacophony of noises of what should we do to combat this. Like we've seen in COVID, people who are not experts still thinking that their opinion is not only relevant but is worth hearing by the multitude. This is part of the problem, because it slows communication down, it dilutes the message, and therefore ultimately it exacerbates the problem. It makes the problem worse. Okay. And that's really what you've got going on in 1340s Florence. The same thing. Human beings don't change much. That's the great thing about literature, guys. The more you read, the more you go, oh my God, people don't actually change that much. They were stupid back then, they're stupid now. Nothing's changed, that's the bottom line. In the same way that they were beautiful and articulate back then, and we still see beauty and articulation today. People are varied. They had their idiots, we have our idiots. They have their geniuses, we have our geniuses. It's so good to read that, and quite humbling to realise that human nature really does not change. All that changes is the superficial stuff, like we run around with an iPhone 11 in our pocket and are able to go on the internet. That's the superficial stuff that changes, but human nature itself is this kind of constant. And the more you read, the more that's for me what I truly get from literature. Seeing this old material and going, crikey, they're just the same as us. They're dealing with this the way we're dealing with this. It's crazy. There we go. Okay, moving on. Moreover, the virulence, meaning the kind of level of contagiousness, the virulence of the pest was the greater by reason that intercourse was apt to convey it from the sick to the whole, just as fire devours things greasy or dry when they are brought close to it. So using this analogy of it's like a fire, and it kind of spreads quickly like a fire will when it's surrounded by flammable objects like grease. Nay, the evil went further yet, for not merely by speech or association with the sick was the malady communicated to the healthy with consequent peril of common death, but any that touched the clothes of the sick, or aught that had been touched by them, seemed thereby to contract the disease. So even by touching the clothing of an infected person, you were likely to catch this. This was a very high reproductive rate on the virus. So we talk about this kind of, is it the R0 thing that we talk about right now with COVID, and trying to get the number below 1, so that it doesn't spread to more than one person per one person, a ratio. This one feels extremely contagious, hence why 2/3 of Florence died from it. We can't even comprehend those sort of numbers, can we? We just imagine us going back to school in September and 2/3 of your classmates are no longer with us because of COVID. Imagine how that would feel. This is another level of, like I say, another level of not only virulence, contagiousness, but also deadliness as well. Okay, this is very, very bad. So yeah, there's nothing new under the sun, and in fact, what we're going through now is Mickey Mouse compared to what our ancestors have been through already. Next bit. So marvellous sounds that which I have now to relate, that had not many, and I among them, observed it with their own eyes, and I had hardly dared to credit it, much less to set it down in writing, though I had had it from the lips of a credible witness. So he's saying, I almost didn't believe it myself unless I'd have seen it with these eyes of mine. So that was the only factor. I had to see this to believe it. Here we go. Here's the story. I say that such was the energy of the contagion of the said pestilence, that it was not merely propagated from man to man, but what is more startling, it was frequently observed that things which had belonged to one sick or dead of the disease, if touched by some other living creature, not of even the human species, were the occasion not merely of sickening, but an almost instantaneous death. Whereof my own eyes, as I said a little before, had cognizance, meaning like had seen and were aware, had cognizance, one among many others, by the following experience. The rags of a poor man who had died of the disease were strewn about the open streets. 2 hogs came thither, and after, as was their wont, no little trifling with their snouts, took the rags between their teeth and tossed them to and fro about their chaps, whereupon, almost immediately, they gave a few turns and fell down dead, as if by poison upon the rags which in an evil hour they had disturbed. So in this story that he's seen with his own eyes, 2 hogs have walked the streets, because again, medieval Europe wasn't like today. You'd see animals roaming the streets, mixing with humans, and 2 wild hogs, or even domesticated hogs, I don't know, have snuffled and prodded a dead man's clothing, and then done that, chewed it a bit, and then literally seconds later have died on the spot, dropped down dead. So whether that's a true story or just an exaggeration, we don't know, but that's something he claims to have seen with his own eyes. Okay. So already we've seen just how virulent this particular disease is. Moving forward slightly, so we're in chapter 1 still, but it's a little bit further forward. He continues. Not all died, neither did all escape, but rather there were of each sort and in every place many that sickened, and by those who retained their health were treated after the example which they themselves while whole had set, being everywhere left to languish in almost total neglect. Tedious were it to recount how citizen avoided citizen, how among neighbours was scarce found any that showed fellow feeling for another, how kinsfolk held aloof and never met or but rarely. So he's saying that people avoided one another, even kinsfolk, family would hold aloof, would stay away from their other relatives, or meet very rarely, because they were that concerned about the pandemic. Enough that this sore affliction entered so deep into the minds of men and women, that in the horror thereof brother was forsaken by brother, nephew by uncle, brother by sister, and oftentimes husband by wife, nay, what is more, and scarcely to be believed, fathers and mothers were found to abandon their own children, untended, unvisited to their fate, as if they had been strangers. Wherefore, meaning as a result of this, wherefore, the sick of both sexes, whose number could not be estimated, were left without resource but in the charity of friends, and few such there were, or in the interest of servants, who were ordered to be had at a high rates and on unseemly terms, and being, moreover, one and all, men and women of gross understanding, and for the most part unused to such offices, concerned themselves no further than to supply the immediate and expressed wants of the sick, and to watch them die, in which service they themselves not seldom perished with their gains. So because so many families forsook one another, were forsaken, avoided each other, you were left to you had to employ someone. If you were ill, you had to employ a servant, and that servant very often would then think, well, okay, I'm poor, and I'm going to go and work for this ill man who's rich, and I'm going to, hopefully if he dies, I'll be able to take his money. So there was a kind of mercenary quality to everybody's behaviour. People were thinking about how much can I make out of this. But even those people very often died. So by taking on the job, the chances are by being around this sick person, you died. He's also got this idea that the people who took the job of servant were not qualified nurses. So it's a bit like, your school nurse at primary school who, I broke my leg, oh miss, I think I broke my leg, oh, have some apple juice, love. This is kind of like they've got no idea how to deal with this, so they essentially just watched them die, but in doing so very often they caught it themselves and died themselves as well. So there's a real sense of futility to everything that's going on in this sort of depiction of Florence. Okay, goes on. In which service they themselves not seldom perished with their gains. So they very often did actually die as well. In consequence, so as a result of this, in consequence of which, dearth of servants, dearth meaning lack of, so there's just not enough servants to fill the jobs, there's not enough people to fill the jobs. A dearth is the opposite of like an abundance. So I might say, oh, there's a real dearth of activity in this sort of room or whatever, so there's not enough going on. It's like the opposite of too much abundance. So there's a dearth of supply, there's a dearth of servants. In consequence of which, dearth of servants and dereliction of the sick by neighbours, kinsfolk and friends, it came to pass, a thing perhaps never before heard of, that no woman, however dainty, fair or well born she might be, shrank when stricken with the disease from the ministrations of a man, no matter whether he was young or not, or scrupled to expose to him every part of her body, with no more shame than if he had been a woman submitting of necessity to that which her malady required, wherefrom perchance there resulted in after time some loss of modesty in such as recovered. I think this is where the Decameron is starting to sort of prepare the reader for the tone of the Decameron itself, because in this chapter 1 he's saying that because people were so ill and afraid of dying, they threw caution to the wind when it came to kind of modesty and what is deemed proper. So, for example, women in medieval society were not supposed to flirt with men and show themselves kind of openly to a man, particularly. But here they're treating men like they would their female friends. They're sort of undressing and saying, "Look at this spot on my hip or on my breast." So he's trying to sort of prepare us for what's going on, saying that people just gave up being modest, gave up being cautious because they were so afraid of death. They'd rather say, well, look, and they'd strip off in front of anybody as if to say, look at this. So there's a loss of modesty. I think that's important for the context of this novel, because the Decameron essentially is about stories of humour and kind of, sometimes they're quite crude. So the stories in here are quite funny but quite crude, and it's about breaking through those social barriers of, this is not how you're supposed to behave, but in these stories people do, so maybe that's what he's doing here. He's sort of laying the groundwork for what's to come. Okay, besides which many succumbed who with proper attendance would perhaps have escaped death, so that what with the virulence of the plague and the lack of due attendance on the sick, the multitude of the deaths that daily and nightly took place in the city was such that those who heard the tale, not to say witnessed the fact, were struck dumb with amazement, whereby practices contrary to the former habits of the citizens could hardly fail to grow up among the survivors. Okay, so the last bit we're going to look at today, before I set you the homework, is where he talks about the kind of genuine results of this pandemic, and just how this level of fatality, this level of kind of deadliness actually looked on street level. Okay, because it's easy to throw around these figures like 2/3 of the city died. What we can't necessarily appreciate today is what that looks like on street level, living there and enduring that. So this next paragraph is quite grim, but I'll prepare you for that. It had been, as today it still is, the custom for the women that were neighbours and of kin to the deceased to gather in his house with the women that were most closely connected with him, to wail with them in common, while on the other hand his male kinsfolk and neighbours, with not a few of the other citizens and a due proportion of the clergy, according to his quality, assembled without in front of the house, to receive the corpse. And so the dead man was borne on the shoulders of his peers, with funeral pomp of taper and dirge, to the church selected by him before his death. So men arrived from the church to collect the dead and take them away to be buried. to the allotted burial place that this particular person chose for themselves. Which rites, as the pestilence waxed in fury, were either in whole or in great part disused, and gave way to others of a novel order. So he's saying that people didn't, the priests didn't necessarily follow the instructions of the deceased. You know, this person left in his will, I want to be buried in St Mary's churchyard, and they were taken to another churchyard down the road because it was easier. People were just not being, their wishes were not granted because it was so desperate. Okay. For not only did no crowd of women surround the bed of the dying, but many passed from this life unregarded, and few indeed were they to whom were accorded the lamentations and bitter tears of sorrowing relations. Nay, for the most part their place was taken by the laugh, the jest, the festal gathering, observances which the women, domestic piety in large measure set aside, had adopted with very great advantage to their health. Few also there were whose bodies were attended to the church by more than 10 or 12 of their neighbours, and those not the honourable and respected citizens, but a sort of corpse carriers drawn from the baser ranks, who called themselves becchini, and performed such offices for hire, would shoulder the bier, and with hurried steps carry it, not to the church of the dead man's choice, but to that which was nearest at hand, with 4 or 6 priests in front, and a candle or two, or perhaps none. Nor did the priests distress themselves with too long and solemn an office, but with the aid of the becchini hastily consigned the corpse to the first tomb which they found untenanted. So again, just reiterating this idea that there was many people springing up with these new jobs, including carrying the bodies to the church. These people were called becchini, but even they were looking to make a quick buck, so they would just carry them to the nearest church available, dump the body, and then, right, where's my money, mate? So there was a kind of mercenary quality to this. Which is not the kind of milk of human kindness we're looking for, is it? I mean, we've all clapped the NHS, we've all had this kind of, hopefully, we've seen the better side of humanity in COVID-19 lockdown, but we've also seen the kind of grim side. We've seen, no bog rolls available in Asda because people are too selfish to and wanted to stockpile it. We have seen the worst, we've seen the best, and we've seen the worst. This is really saying that when people are presented with a crisis, the worst comes out, and that's really what we've got here. We've got family abandoning family, that's happening, and we've also got these like new industries springing up that are there to make a quick buck. So the kind of becchini, which are carrying bodies, but dumping them wherever they can just to make a quick buck. It doesn't feel like, I say, the milk of human kindness is strong within this community. Okay, it's all about looking after number one. Okay. The condition of the lower, and perhaps in great measure of the middle ranks of the people, showed even worse and more deplorable. For, deluded by hope or constrained by poverty, they stayed in their quarters, in their houses, where they sickened by thousands a day, and being without service or help of any kind, were, so to speak, irredeemably devoted to the death which overtook them. Many died daily or nightly in the public streets. Of many others who died at home, the departure was hardly observed by their neighbours, until the stench of their putrefying bodies carried the tidings. So in other words, the news was carried to their neighbours because they got the smell before they got the kind of, the headline from the local newspaper. It was the smell that got there first, which is again a grim image. The putrefying bodies carried the tidings, and what with their corpses and the corpses of others who died on every hand, the whole place was a sepulchre. So saying the entire city felt like a huge kind of graveyard. Okay. So we're going to pause the read there for this session, number 20. I've chosen, like I say, from the Decameron because I feel it's been, okay, it's not a celebratory kind of woohoo, let's get the party cake out because it's number 20, but it's for me about, well, why are we in this mess and what's happened and why am I still making these videos 3 months later? And I went back to this because I read it years ago, and it kind of jogged my memory. There's something about the plague that I might want to revisit in this first few pages of the Decameron, and I wasn't disappointed going back. Actually, it's been very interesting to read, and think about comparisons, the parallels between how they handled this outbreak and how we're handling this outbreak too. It feels there are a lot of similarities. You know, maybe we have been better and we've had more of the milk of human kindness this time round because we are more civilized and we're more advanced as a species. Or maybe it's just because this is a much less deadly plague. Maybe if COVID were as bad as this, we'd see again the uglier side of humanity. Maybe, who knows? Hopefully we'll never find out. But it's been interesting for me to read that and compare the two. Your job, I'm going to leave in the description the next 2 paragraphs of the text. Your job is to summarise what is going on in layman's terms. Now, to help you, there are some, and I'm going to put them on the screen now, some words and phrases from the original, from this Victorian translation. Here they are, this Victorian translation, and here are some of the words and phrases you will encounter in your homework. And here on the other side is what I think they mean in a kind of layman's terms or modernised way. So your job is to maybe, if you're struggling, to pause the screen now, jot down some of these words and phrases and what they mean, or just read it, and if you encounter it and don't understand it, come back to this moment right now to have a look again. So your job is to summarise what is he saying about, you know, the way Florence dealt with the plague and the kind of next step of this kind of reaction from the city. Okay, hopefully you enjoyed that. Thank you for listening. I think the skills we're building on today's session are the ability to understand Victorian vocabulary, particularly that kind of Victorian way of expressing ideas and expressing sort of structuring narrative, that kind of thing, because this feels very Victorian in the way it's been translated. Also the kind of on the kind of sort of moral level, we've kind of thought about, you know, the way that there are parallels between the Black Death in the 1300s and maybe the modern day pandemic of COVID-19, and we thought about the kind of human impact there as well. Okay, hopefully you've enjoyed that. Leave some likes if you have. Leave some comments, please. Email me your homework. Let me have a look at what you're doing. What did you think of that? Anything is great. Any engagement you can have at this point is great. Okay, let's spread the love. Let's keep everything going. We're nearly there, guys. I hope to see you on September. This, hopefully, touch wood, will be the last lockdown learning video, certainly in this style. Okay. It's been a great one, guys. Over and out.